I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. I think 2:30 has come, so appreciate you braving the weather. We had a little snow again. We were worried, of course, about Monday. He said he called. I called him on Sunday. He said, "I think I can make it." I said, "No, you can't." I said, "You might have had 3 or 4 inches of snow in Sioux Falls, but we had about 13 to 14 here in Watertown." So, but we're glad he did make it today. The roads weren't the greatest today as he came up the interstate. But we were glad he did. We gave a presentation over at the high school this morning. It went very well. The kids seemed to be very well.
They were quiet anyway.
They were quiet. So I figured you just gave a very good presentation that they didn't have any questions. They must have all had those questions answered. So.
What is it, a semi? A big group or just a small group?
It was all the history kids that were part of that group over there. We had probably 75, 80, but anyway. Jeff Gould is my presenter's name today. He comes from Sioux Falls. He works with a couple of funeral homes in Sioux Falls, doing some pre-funding, neat things. But that's all he's here today for, is that he is going to give us some events that led up to the assassination of our President Abraham Lincoln. And then he will go more into detail about the funeral procession to follow, the many days following the death of Lincoln and all the details surrounding that. So I hope you enjoy him as much as I have. I've seen him a couple times now. Things went it's very interesting. So if you like the Civil War, if you like Abraham Lincoln, you're going to love the presentation he's going to give today. So without further ado, Jeff Gould.
Thanks, Maury. And that's a little bit more than I got this morning from the high school kids, so I appreciate that. So we're on a good deal here. My name is Jeff Gould. We'll be talking about the funeral of Abraham Lincoln. If you were to do a study or a poll of Americans, say, who would you say is the greatest or most influential American, there would be 3 names that would probably be brought up over and over again. I'm going to take the one that you want to answer. Lincoln is one of them. Who are the other 2? Washington would be the other one. And who's the other one?
Jefferson.
No, not a president. Franklin, that's right. Franklin. Ben Franklin, because of all the other inventions that he had, the library and all the other kind of cool stuff, and electricity, which we're thankful for today. So let's move on. So Abraham Lincoln why is he so influential? Somebody asked me once, will there ever be a president as great as Lincoln? And I always answer, well, I hope not. And the reason I say that is because a great president has to work through tremendous adversity. And the presidencies of Lincoln, and for that matter, Washington, I mean, I just don't want to live through times like that. I mean, he did some amazing things. I think to help us understand history, I love history. I'm not a historian. Now, I would say a historian would be a guy who would dig up the original artifacts and letters and read those things. I'm a guy who reads the books the historian writes. And I'm a Lincoln fan. I've been for a number of years, and I find his story very, very compelling and applicable to our lives today. And I think that's the history, and that's the secret of enjoying history, is applying lessons of the past to our lives today. And so, let us look back at the time of the first presidential election he was involved in, 1860. I find it interesting that people, as we speak today, are lamenting how poor the country is running because of the feud between the Republican and the Democrats. And they're saying, like, well, it's never been this bad. Oh, yeah, it has. It's been way, way worse than that. And this is what's going on in the year 1860. And it's horribly divisive. The country is not split in 2, it's split in 4. And what is the issue that's dividing the country at this time?
Slavery.
Slavery is exactly right. I mean, they knew this when they set up the country. George Washington, among other people, lamented this compromise they put together. They weren't sure how long it would last. And sure enough, it's come to the end. Because in the North, there is a new party called the Republican Party, and they do not want to have slavery expand into the new states. You can keep it in the South, but they don't want it. They don't want it spread. In the South, they say, no, you can't say that. We have agreed that each state can can decide what they want to do. Let the states decide. So they don't see this as a slavery issue. They see this as a states' rights issue. And the debate has grown heated, and it's grown so heated that these people in the South, who are called fire eaters, had said, you know what, if a Republican wins, we're out. We can do what we want. We will form our own union. It's important to remember that at that time, you weren't necessarily, let's put it this way, there was no such thing as the United States of America at the time we're talking about. There is no such thing as the United States of America. It was referred to as these United States of America. And you would say, I am a Virginian. That would be your loyalty. Or I'm a Pennsylvanian. And yes, I happen to belong to the Union, but your loyalty was really to your region and state. In the South, their life is just, it's way different. It's agricultural. Cotton is king. Slave labor is how we grow that cotton. This is our life. This is the way we do things. In the North, they've got a completely different way. The economist Adam Smith has said that slavery is not immoral necessarily, but it certainly is inefficient. We can agree on that. And so he is a proponent of the Industrial Revolution in the North, is all about building factories and mills and railroads and canals. And so by the time we're talking about, in the year 1860, there are more miles of railroad track in the North than in the rest of the world combined. So the North is a completely different culture. The people who really start to support the Republican Party are the new immigrants to the North who are working in the factories. And they like it because they say, hey, no slave labor in the North. It's not a moral issue for them, it's an economic issue. I don't have to have any competition for my job. So they love the idea of no expansion of slavery. The people in the North like this Republican idea of a strong federal union, sort of an overarching government, because it makes things a little bit easier when you work across state borders. So if you're starting to build your empire of railroads and cross boundaries, this overarching federal thing looks good to you. So that's where they'll get their financial backing. And there is a set of radical people to the left who supports this party because they see the moral problems with slavery, and they're abolitionists. These three groups form a tremendously strong, powerful union. And they are going, whoever gets that nomination is going to be president in 1860. And that person, they all understand, boy, are we going to have problems. So we need a president. We need a Republican who is a tremendous statesman, a great speaker, powerful, the most powerful Republican, the most popular Republican, the person with the greatest recognition, not just here but abroad. And so everybody agrees that that president should most definitely be William Seward. Because William Seward, I mean, he's it. He's from New York. He is the most powerful and most popular Republican in the country. Unfortunately, he's also the most hated. Now people say, well, how can that be? And I say, does anybody here know who the New York Yankees are? The baseball team. Most powerful, most popular baseball team, most hated baseball team. Those of us who are Twins fans, we know what this is about. And so what happens is that Seward cannot get that majority he needs. He's a little bit short, and he has more friends than enemies the closer he gets to the top. Who are other possible candidates? There's Salmon Chase, who's from Ohio. He's a genius. He's also an egotistical swellhead, and he's not going to give up Ohio, and nobody's going to go on his side either. We have Edwin Bates, who was kind of put together He's from Illinois area, Missouri, Illinois, and he's put together a political machine. The Blairs have kind of put him up as a conservative guy. He's a very nice guy, but not very ambitious. The guy who seems to be a dark horse is this Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, well, let's just look at him as the first people who would see him would look at him. Abraham Lincoln is ugly. It's the first thing you'll notice about Abraham Lincoln. Now, wait a minute. You can't say that. If you were to see Abraham Lincoln for the first time, he is a homely man. In his administration, he recognizes this. That's why he has so many photographs of him taken, so people can get used to how he looks. In political cartoons, he is drawn as a baboon. William Seward calls him an amiable baboon. What's that? At least he said amiable. All right, yeah, because here's the thing about Abraham Lincoln. First, besides his homely appearance, he is also freakishly tall. He is 6'4", at a time when the average guy is about like yay. Okay? 165 pounds. You seen the movie Lincoln? The voice is perfect. Daniel Day-Lewis does a great job on the voice because it's not what we think. 7 years ago. No, nothing like that. It's a high, reedy tenor voice with a thick backwoods accent. It has a habit of going shrill if he's making a point about something. He also, like, when he gets animated and going, he'll have a habit of kind of going up and down on his toes and kind of doing this, and he's tugging on his elbow and pulling on his ear, and kind of looks like a puppet on a string. And when he gets to talking, people laugh at him. But he is funny. He is smart. He knows that he will not be the first choice. He figures my best shot is to be the second choice. I don't have to beat Salmon Chase. I just have to make sure that other people like Salmon Chase like me second best to him. So he builds his strategy to be the second favorite of all these guys running in front. And sure enough, he gets the nomination. When the papers come out the next day, they are all in universal agreement that it is a disaster. We are facing the worst crisis in our nation's history, and we have this unknown hick trying to save our union. It's not going to work. You know, they talk about a honeymoon period in the president, the first 100 days. Okay, he gets into office as the front runner, but not with a majority. So more people don't like him going in than like him. There's an assassination plot on his life as he's going to the inauguration. He is extremely unpopular during his tenure as president. How can that be, I hear? How can that be? Okay, for one thing, there's a war going on, and presidents, the longer a war goes on, the less popular the sitting president becomes, especially if it's a bloody one. And our situation in Iraq and Afghanistan, how many casualties, how many deaths have we had in those two wars combined? 4,000, 8,000, something like that. I think we stopped counting a while ago, but somewhere around 8,000 deaths. No, and the longer it goes on, the less people like it, because they don't like to see family members dying, regardless of the cause. Well, Abraham Lincoln, going into office, there are people who say right out of the gate, what is the point? Let them go. We don't need them. We'll just keep going on with our own country. Abraham Lincoln did not go into office on the basis of slavery. It was about preservation of the Union, saying that what God joined together, let no man split asunder. And he said this, we'll all be either one thing or the other, meaning we'll all be slave or we'll all be free, but we will be it together. And he paid every single imaginable cost to make that come true. Personally, can you imagine what it would be like to run a war as bloody as the Civil War? Now, we heard Iraq and Afghanistan, 8,000, let's say. I'll pick one battle, the Battle of Shiloh, 1862. Okay? In that one battle, 13,000 Union soldiers killed. 11,000 Confederate soldiers killed. That's 24,000 killed in a battle that lasted 2 days. On the battlefield, after it was over, you could not walk across the battlefield because the field was covered with bodies. We talk about the inventions that happened that make this possible. Of course, we talk about mills and factories, but the Industrial Revolution also invented weapons that were so effective the world had not seen anything like this before. They started seeing casualties with 1 and 2 and 3 zeros at the end. The invention that comes out of the Civil War that's most illustrative of this is dog tags. Until the Civil War, they were not necessary. Because when a group went into battle, there were always enough survivors to come back and identify them. And now an entire company would be wiped out. And now they all became anonymous. So it became an invention that we would now label every soldier with dog tags. So that after the casualties, we knew who they were. Try being a president over that one. And battle after battle, year after year. So, now we know why Lincoln was so unpopular. It wasn't until the end of his first administration, really into August and September, that we start to see the generals, Grant and Sherman, starts to have some effect. And it really isn't until the spring. Of course, he wins re-election finally. And then finally in the spring, this war might be over. Of 400 to 600,000 casualties to 1.6 million, depending on what you decide is a casualty or not. All of that heartache and grief. Now, I'll just mention this as an aside. Do you know why we passed the 18th Amendment on Prohibition? You ever think about that? Why do we do that? You know what they called alcoholism in the late 1800s, early 1900s? The soldier's disease. We know what post-traumatic stress syndrome is, right? These boys had no training. They were given a gun and marched into hell. And every single one of them, not every single one of them, but vast majorities self-medicated themselves for decades afterwards with alcohol. And that's why Americans got fed up with it, because it was too much. We have the perspective today of saying, well, that would never work. You see why they did it at the time. What a tremendous trauma to the nation. And this guy was at the helm, and he was not liked. At the very end of the battle, of the year, of course, we have Lee surrendering. And now people just start coming around. You know what? Maybe Abraham Lincoln was right. Maybe he did do the right thing. And there's going to be a celebration. It's a Good Friday, 1865, and the nation has just heard about Lee surrendering. So Mary Todd Lincoln says, you know what? It's Good Friday. There's a lot of seats available. Let's go see a movie. Of course, there's no movies at the time, but there's the theater. And Ford's Theater has this hilarious comedy called My American Cousin. Let's go see the show. And for the first time in really his life, people comment on how happy Lincoln seems that day. But as the day wears on, he just says, you know, I'm tired. I just don't want to go. And his wife said, but you know, a lot of people will be there. A lot of soldiers will be there. They want to congratulate you. They want to see you. You really should go. And so he relents, and at the last minute he does go. And he is shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth. He lingers into the morning. He dies at 7:22. And then the nation experiences something that it's never experienced yet. It is the largest funeral in history. Kennedy's was numerically larger, but in terms of a proportion of the population, its impact and effect on a populace, nothing compares to Lincoln's funeral. For a long time after the war, if you went into a clock store, all the clocks were set at 7:22. 7:22. That happened all the way up to World War I. And then they changed that to 5 minutes past 11. Why? V is in victory. Well, now I think they're still that way. I don't know. 7:22. It became a big time most people knew about. Lincoln's funeral is, well, it's unusual. It's trend-setting. And I mean that. Some of you from European backgrounds have maybe commented, hey, what is the deal with American funerals? How come they're so different from the way they were in Germany or England or whatever? Abraham Lincoln is the reason why. To this day, most of us still have the Abraham Lincoln funeral. What? How can that be? Well, you know what? Presidents or heads of state have that ability to change public perception almost instantaneously. Those of you who were alive when JFK was inaugurated can speak to this, because all men wore a hat. That's what you did. On a day like today, you had a nice hat. Snap brim, fedora, whatever. He goes to the inauguration with no hat, hat sales, done. To this day, people do not wear hats. Well, maybe baseball caps, but you know what I'm saying. I think it was McKinley or Taft, one of those presidents, got up and stretched during a long baseball game in the 7th inning, and what do we do? The 7th inning stretch to this day. So it is. Lincoln's funeral becomes the funeral to have. If it was good enough for Lincoln, it's good enough for me. And the major thing that's changed is, he is embalmed. Embalming is a new thing. He likes it. Nobody else really does. I mean, Lincoln was a fan of embalming. Lincoln liked all kinds of inventions. He was a somewhat macabre, melancholy sort of guy. And so he liked the thoughts of preserving a body through embalming. At that time, they would take these heavy sort of compounds, fluids with arsenic, zinc, lead-based compounds that they would replace the bloodstream with and preserve the body. And he thought it was a great idea. When his son Willie died, he had him embalmed. And it became what everybody else did too, because here's what they realized. Now you can see the body. Why would you want that? Well, if you think about back in the time, you would hear stories about women who would be dressed in black their whole life, or the widow's walk on the second story of a house. Most of that has to do with people not coming to grips that somebody has died. The most current analogy I can give you is 9/11. Now, you may come to the realization in your head that the people who were in that tower died. But if it's your family member, will you really believe it in here if you do not see the body? Now, let's look at the 400,000 to 600,000 who were killed in the Civil War. When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, the boys will cheer, the men will shout, the ladies will all turn out when Johnny comes marching home. But he didn't. By the hundreds of thousands, he didn't. What happened to Johnny? Well, I don't know, Mrs. Johnson. I mean, we went in, and I don't know what happened. It was loud and smoke and noise and hell. I don't know what happened to him. And the weeks turn into months and years, and you never see Johnny. So did he die? So embalming, once Lincoln took it and made it acceptable, now people said, this becomes popular. In fact, it becomes so popular that in current day prices, people would pay $10,000 just to have somebody embalmed. Doctors quit becoming doctors and became embalmers because the money was better and the complaints were fewer. Right? We have taken for granted, because of embalming and refrigeration and transportation, just what it means to view a body. A lot of times you need to see that for here. Okay. Anyway, they announced to the press that the president will be available to be viewed. They say it at 8 o'clock in the morning, and by noon in Washington, D.C., there is a line 8 people across and 2 miles long to see the president. Whew. And it just starts to escalate from here. Okay, this is the funeral bill. You know, we're used to fine print in this business, right? $8,900 is what we got here for a total. Let me see, a couple of things to take out of this. The doctor's bill I see is $5.90. It's before copay, so it's wasn't a bad deal there. For that, you got 3 pounds worth of mustard. I don't know what that was for. Maybe for sandwiches, I didn't say. But anyway, we have the casket itself, which is $1,500. Oh, I said casket. That's not right. It's coffin. Sir, would you be so kind as to stand for me, please? Tell me your name.
Mike Mullen.
Okay, Mike. So the difference between a casket and a coffin is that a coffin is made to order, just like in the movies, right? So you kind of measure, wide through the shoulders, narrow at the feet. Made, no, you're fine. Go ahead, have a seat. And then made to fit. So Lincoln, 6'4", 165 pounds. This coffin is made to fit him. It's extremely fancy for the time. It's walnut. It's lined with lead, and then white cloth and the black on the outside. Somebody said, "What's with the lead lining?" Kryptonite. No, I'm kidding. It was because that's how they would seal caskets before rubber, sealing things. They would solder them closed. And then we have black, silver accoutrements, very elaborate for the time. Okay. We also notice a lot of white and black bunting. Black we understand. What's with the white? He is shot on Good Friday. He dies the day before Easter. And the theme for his funerals is very much an Easter theme. If you've been to Springfield to the Lincoln Library, you'll see the room laid in state. A lot of black, but also white with lilies. The idea and the metaphor that's used throughout this, the Sunday churches, pastors, ministers, priests giving this message, just like God the Father had the Son who sacrificed his life. George Washington, father of the nation, you'd see him in that funeral, a bust of Washington, and then you have a bust of Lincoln, the son who dies for the people. Common theme. Here is the trip back home. And he is buried in Springfield, Illinois. And this is a little bit of a debate because when he dies, the first thought is, well, we had this really nice place set up in Washington, D.C. for George Washington, and at the last minute we sent him to Mount Vernon. This is perfect. And everybody goes along with that except the political people from Illinois who said he is from Illinois, he's going back home, and Mary Todd Lincoln, who said he wasn't president, true, but he was also father, and he was from Illinois. So he's going home to Springfield. He talked about that cemetery outside of town, and he's to be buried with his sons. By the way, Mary Todd Lincoln does not go to the funeral or the visitation. She stays in Washington, D.C. And she wears black for the rest of her life. And her life is messed up after that. We might talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so here's the trip. And one of the reasons why it's the largest funeral in history is because of modern inventions. We have embalming. That means that the body can stay viewable for 3 weeks. We have the train, which means it can go large distances. And we have the telegraph, so we can tell everybody about it. So let's just say, Mike, that you are in charge of the funeral arrangements in Washington, D.C. Okay? And sir, what's your name?
Jim.
Jim. Jim, let's just say that you're responsible for the funeral services in New York City. And you, thanks to the telegraph, can read all about in the local newspaper everything that Mike does. Are you going to do the same thing, Jim, when he gets to New York? Probably. No. Obviously, we can tell that Jim's a fake New Yorker. A real New Yorker would immediately say, those hicks down there, they don't know how to really do it. We're going to double up everything he does. We're going to do better. And that is the way everybody thinks along the line. And we see an escalation as the funeral continues. It becomes larger and larger and larger. Here's the funeral train. There's actually this one, which is just a solo engine, which traveling by itself, all dressed in black, tolling a bell as it goes slowly down the tracks. 25 miles an hour in the country, 5 to 10 miles an hour in the towns. The rails are packed with people, all dressed in black. It's rainy, drizzly. People travel muddy roads to light funeral pyres and sob uncontrollably. Why? Well, some of it was guilt, I think, because they had maligned the president during his 4 years. Maybe they felt kind of bad. Some of it was anxiety. Remember now, we still have a war going on. The South hasn't officially surrendered yet, just one of the armies. John Wilkes Booth, he's still at large. Something about going to something orderly kind of calms the masses down. Probably the biggest reason is it's a surrogate funeral for their own loss. Couldn't go to my husband's. I just feel the need to go to this one. People ask if the train runs on time. Yes, sort of. There is no time at this time. And by that I mean there's no agreed time. Think about this time. Most of us would just get up when it's light outside, go to bed when it's dark. The factory whistle goes, you go there. Nobody really cares what time it is at some other place. The only people who do care are the people who run the railroads. And so every railroad has its own clock. And if you go to the rail station, you would see 8 clocks, one for each of the railroads that might serve that depot. No central time, no Eastern, who cares? Only after that do they start to divide the country into zones, and do we start to really care about what time it is elsewhere in the country. Funeral train car, there are eight of them. One for the president and his son, Willie, who was disinterred for the trip back. One for, these are the honor guard, and this is just a few of them. There's a total of 800 Army of the Republic veterans who serve as the honor guard. Very prestigious and revered afterwards. A lot of guys would talk about it. They all got the Congressional Medal of Honor just for being in the funeral. They rescinded that later on. In the 1900s, early on, like 1914, I think, the government decided we want to reserve that just for truly valorous conduct, so they rescinded all those medals. And I asked once, well, how do you rescind medals once you give them? It's sort of like, well, you can still have it, you can just never wear it again. And we have the rest of the 6 cars with the mourners. And so here is the only photo of the president at his own funeral. Why? Well, because Stanton, Edwin Stanton, who was in charge of the War Department, he's the one who kind of was running this funeral procession. He's the one who said no pictures to be taken of the president lying in state. Well, this photographer from Albany goes to New York and takes this photo, and they arrest him, and they break up all his equipment and smash all the pictures, except this one, which is sent down to Washington, D.C. They decide they'll keep it, but then they lose it. This is lost until the year 1965. So the question is this. For the next 100 years, there is no picture of the president at his own funeral. So if there's no picture of the president at his own funeral, did he really die? See, it didn't just start with Elvis. A lot of the conspiracy stuff had to do with what really happened to Lincoln. Because, well, he must have had a twin that wasn't him. It was a body double, all the sorts of conspiracies. And by the way, there were many, 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 many conspiracies on Lincoln during his administration. The tragedy, it's not a tragedy that he was assassinated. It's a miracle that he made it as long as he did. In a very real way. No Secret Service to speak of, a city in the South, everybody in Washington armed. Anyway, I'm talking about this. Did you notice this is a bust of Washington? This is a bust of Lincoln. This is a little bit of the Easter theme that you can kind of see in that. Okay, so this is what Mike comes up with for the funeral procession in Washington. And the first thing that Mike thinks of is that, wait a minute, even though the entire country is segregated, north and south, we better make this equally accessible to people of all races. Because Lincoln is truly the savior of the slave, they revere him, and we better give them full access to all parts of the funeral or there will be riots. So that's the first thing that Mike does. You can see the hearse that he comes up with, nice and somber. Jim, are you paying attention to this?
Yes.
Okay. You know, let's just be honest. I think you can do better, okay? What do you... no offense, Mike. Now look at what do you see about the flags? They're not lowered, are they? They're not at half-mast. Well, what is that about? Well, so I did a little research on that. The idea of flags at half-mast is a naval thing. So if your captain died while you were, at sea, and they would do a lot of signals with all kinds of flags, but if your flag was at half-mast, that meant that either the admiral or the captain had died. So it's strictly a nautical thing. And then it gradually transitioned to heads of state or important people. The question was, had it gone to governments at this time? This would tell us no. One of the things that's interesting about history is that the more you study history, the less you know. It's sort of like, I always think it's like having first one watch, then two, then six. You have one watch, you always know what time it is. The more watches you have, you never know. And so we have from the words of William Seward, who was badly injured in the assassination attempt on Lincoln. They also tried to kill him at his home. He knew that Lincoln was dead, he said, by looking out his window 3 days later and seeing the flags at half-mast. So, I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so Jim, good job. See, Jim? See what he does? Makes it a little bit bigger. More flags. More pom-poms on top. Very nice. Sadly for Jim, other cities are paying attention. And we get to Columbus, and we're going to add another layer. It's going to take more horses to pull it, but that's fine. We'll get them all so they're white and matched with the stuff. They're very nice. In fact, I think it's in Columbus. The town is big enough, or I should say the town is small enough, and the mourners are big enough that there's no facility big enough for the funeral, so they have to hold it outside. And as it progressed, it seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, until we get to Springfield, Illinois. This is the hearse that's used there. It's a beautiful coach. Only used once for this funeral. Donated. Later displayed at a museum. Becomes a huge tourism thing. Destroyed in a fire in 1902. Jim does something different when they get to New York. He says, how about a funeral arch? So this says, we mourn a nation's loss. That's a nice little touch. Jim, you see, he does not, he also has a flag, not at half-mast. Hard to make out on this. So now we move on and see what other people do. We get to Michigan City, Indiana. We get a nicer display. In fact, this is thrown up kind of at the last minute. This is not supposed to be a stop along the way, but it's about 70 miles outside of Chicago, and there's a lot of people who want to hop on the train to be mourners for the last leg of the journey, so they throw this up at the last minute. And the big place is really when they get to Chicago. Look at that. See? That is quite an arch. Can you see what the hearse has become here? It is like a rolling stage now. These are all, I think there's 38 women dressed in white. I could not find out the symbology behind 38. It didn't match the states in the Union. That was my first check on, but I forget the number, but it didn't match anything I could find. We do know this, there's 500,000 people in Chicago. That's way bigger than the town has capacity for. Sidewalks collapsing from the weight of all of the mourners. There are notices in the paper that say, ladies, if you are to go, do not wear your bustle skirts, or you will be suffocated in the hordes and crowds of people. It becomes more and more of an event as people come to revere and remember. Springfield, Illinois, that's his home. Look at the crowds there. I usually point out somebody, like say maybe this person here. I'm sure that person did something with his or her life of importance. But it didn't really matter anymore, because from then on, all his ancestors would talk about what role he had in Lincoln's funeral. It's amazing. Every time I do one of these things, when I get done, somebody patiently waits and says, you know, just to tell you, here's how I'm related to Abraham Lincoln. Somehow. There may not be actual relation, but somehow they tie it into something. In Sioux Falls, I went to a guy and said, I want you to come to my house. In the basement in his house, it was all Lincoln stuff. Just everything, all the Lincoln collectible things. The last I heard, it had moved out of the room into the basement, into the whole basement, until now the whole house looks like Lincoln stuff. And he's not alone. When Lincoln turned 200, all of that Lincoln memorabilia stuff just spiked, and it's been on a trajectory ever since. More books have been written about Jesus Christ than any other character in history. Number 2 was Napoleon. And Lincoln has left him in the dust. He is now the second most written about person. His life is fascinating. It's an enigma. It's polarizing. It's magnetic. I've given this presentation all kinds of places. I was out at Mount Rushmore on Lincoln's birthday, giving it at the theater there. And I talked to one of the curators. He said, people come from all over the world to see this. It's like the 3rd biggest tourist attraction in the country, which says something, because it's in the middle of nowhere, right? So a lot of people go there. A lot of them don't speak English. They stand in the proscenium, you know what I'm talking about, and they all point to the same president, and they say, Lincoln. And they all nod. Tolstoy You know, War and Peace, Tolstoy. This is like 1900. He's in Siberia. And he's speaking to a group of wandering, nomadic tribespeople. And he's talking about the greatest characters in history. And the chief of this tribe, in the 1900s something, tell us about the man called Lincoln. So the next day he brings back a picture of Lincoln and he shows it around. And he says, can we keep this picture? Huh. He is buried here in Oak Ridge Cemetery. Oh my goodness gracious, I gotta get going. Okay, born at Oak Ridge Cemetery, he's buried here. And you don't build something like that overnight. He is temporarily entombed. Okay, now it gets a little interesting. 1872, one of his other sons, Tad Lincoln, dies. So even though this is half-built, they have a burial ceremony for Willie and Abraham Lincoln and Tad. It's finished in 1874. It should be done, but it isn't. Now it just is really kind of beginning, because you can't see it in this, because this is an older version of that, but the original structure looked more like a church. There was a lot of open windows, stained glass, stuff like that. So there's these guys who decide that it'll be a good job to kidnap the president's body and hold it for ransom. They're going to steal the president's body, take it to a sand dune in Indiana, bury it for $200,000 in gold, and the release of their engraver from prison. It's not a bad idea. They probably should not have come up with the idea in a bar in Chicago. Because right at the very next table, listening to every word, is the Secret Service agent. And they are caught red-handed. Well, fortunately for them, it's not against the law. In the state of Illinois at that time, there's no law against body snatching. All they can get them on is the stealing of a used casket. Valued at $75, it's a misdemeanor. And now the people who built this edifice, the Lincoln Preservation Committee, now they are sick with worry. Because look what they got in the middle of the country in an abandoned cemetery, empty at night. They got this sign that says, please steal me on it practically. They decide they're going to be proactive, and they steal their own body. And quiet, they go into they take the body. There's a tunnel system underneath this area. And they dig down and they hit water. So they try it again and they hit water again. This time they decide they will hide the body off in an abandoned quarter and cover it with construction debris for 2 years. Until things die down and they can build something a little bit more solid. In 1886, they do have an indestructible brick and mortar vault. They have a final entombment. It's a beautiful thing. Until that column starts to sink and crush the indestructible brick and mortar vault. And then they have to start all over again. And by the way, you know what the number one question is when people come to visit Lincoln's tomb? What is the number one question that people have at that time?
Sure it's Lincoln.
Is he there? Are you sure it's Lincoln? Where's Lincoln? No pictures of Lincoln. What about the conspiracies about blah, 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 blah. He becomes like the parlor game of America. Where is Lincoln really? This is disturbing to Robert Todd Lincoln, the surviving son, so that when they finally get this structure done and they're ready for a final committal in 1901, he says, I tell you what, you may look at the body one last time to prove that that is my father and he is there. So the Lincoln Preservation Committee decides that's exactly what they will do, and then they notify all of the media of the time and place. Please come if you'd like to see the president one last time. And the media, to a person, says, "No! Are you kidding me? How macabre! How grotesque! How gross! How beneath our station as people who report news of importance of the day!" Has the media changed their standards, I wonder, since then? You think if we were to do that today, that anybody would even show up with a camera? Anyway, there's no pictorial evidence of what happens. All we have is the memoir of a boy. He's a 10-year-old boy named M.O. Mortensen. His dad's in the Lincoln Preservation Committee, and his dad says, "Tell you what, come along, son, you might learn something." And so this is what he has to say. He said it was night. The workers carried in the casket. By this time, he had been put in a different casket than the one you see here. It's a cedar casket. They removed the lid. There was a copper carapace that had been soldered in place, and with chisels and hammers, they removed that and then peeled it back to a bondage. See, I waited for her to leave, now she'll never know what happened. And there he was. M.O. Mortensen said it looked like he was taking a nap. He was so perfectly preserved. His face was like 3 shades darker than it normally would have been. He had a tie like Maury is wearing right now, and there was a little bit of mildew on one of the columns. The flag that was on his chest had deteriorated somewhat. But M.O. Mortensen said it looked like you could have just touched him on the shoulder and he'd have sat up. He said it was a most auspicious occasion. So they put the lid back on. They then, not at this time, but shortly after, lowered him into the ground where all the family members were buried, except Robert Dodd. There was a steel cage around all of them. And then they poured the whole thing over with 4,000 pounds of concrete. So there could be no more of this guessing. He is buried here. May he rest in peace. As I said before, I've given this all kinds of places to all kinds of groups of people. I gave it last spring to a group of elementary students, and a girl, maybe 5th grade, raised her hand and asked me questions. "Yes, I have a question." I said, "Yes." "Were you there?" I said, I'm 51. She goes, "All right, I get it. I was up in Sturgis and gave this to Jim, and a little girl about the same age raised her hand. And she said, "Was he happy?" I love that question. Was he happy? Was Lincoln happy? No. His disposition was one of melancholy. People would describe him as one of the saddest people they'd ever met. The burdens of the war that he pursued were a palpable weight. But I think he would say he was satisfied. He followed the course that he had laid out for himself and did not deviate from it, regardless of the pressure to do otherwise. And I think that's what makes him one of my favorite presidents, because it's an applicable question. You and I get pressure a lot to not do what we think is right for whatever reasons. Can we, faced with those pressures, still do what we think is the right thing to do, regardless of the cost or sacrifice? His natural state, because of the circumstances of his life, was one of melancholy. You know, back in the day, you and I wouldn't watch TV or radio. We would entertain each other by telling stories or sharing poems that we had memorized. And Lincoln loved to memorize poetry. His favorite poem was this one. He would recite it all of the time. All of the time. In fact, people said, "Did you write that?" He said, "No, I didn't write it, but I'd give any amount of money to have penned such a piece like this." And I'm going to share it with you because I think it tells you his philosophy and probably gives you an insight to what kind of person he was, what his outlook was. It's from William Knox. It's "Why Should the Spirit of Mortal Be Proud?" I won't share all of it, just a few stanzas. "Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud? Like a swift fleeting meteor, a fast flying cloud, like a flash of the lightning, a break of the wave, man passes from life to rest in his grave. The leaves of the oak and the willow shall fade and be scattered around, together be laid, and so the young and the old, and the low and the high, shall molder to dust, and together shall lie. The maid on whose cheek and whose brow and whose eye shone beauty and pleasure, her triumphs are by, and the memory of those who liked her and praised are alike from the mind of the living erased. For we are the same our fathers have been. We see the same sights our fathers have seen. We drink the same stream and see the same sun and run the same course our fathers have run. They died. Aye, they died. And we things that are now, who walk on the turf lies over their brow, who make in our dwelling a transient abode, meet the same things they met on their pilgrimage road. 'Tis the wink of an eye, 'tis the draught of a breath, from the blossom of health to the paleness of death, from the gilded saloon to the bier and the shroud. Why should the spirit of mortal be proud? Any questions for me?
How many states were in these United States at the time that he was president?
How many states were in these United States at the time? Oh boy, oh
We
boy,
have that
oh boy.
flag up there, and I heard it comes.
You know, so the question, I believe it's somewhere around 38. Minnesota came in 1858, so they were in. I forgot. Does anybody know for sure? I forget, but I also looked at that flag in particular because is the flag wrong? There were 3 possible designs, acceptable designs for the American flag at that time. And one resembles that one. And that one is crumpled enough that you can't for sure say that one's the wrong one, but it sure looks like a lot of stars on that flag. Yes?
What happened to his wife?
Mary Todd Lincoln is like that really nice tree in your front of your house in the yard. It gets struck by lightning, and half of it splits away. And it survives, but year after year it just sort of dwindles. And in a very real way, you could say that Mary Todd Lincoln died when her husband did. She had, her friend and ally was Lincoln. His friends didn't like her because she was feisty and opinionated. And all of the autobiographers afterwards didn't like her and kind of threw her under the bus a little bit. You know that whole thing about his sweetheart when he was a younger person, Dan Rutledge, right? Something like that. So he thought that, you know, I think that's a little bit of that is the work of the biographers who did not care for her. He didn't really love her, he loved this other person. She went big into like seances to try to communicate with him from the grave. She had a thing for jewelry. she would go into a jewelry store and say, hey, can I try on that ring? Well, sure, Mrs. Lincoln, wear it as long as you want, thinking that she'd come back and pay for it, which she never did. So Robert Todd had to keep mopping up after her. In fact, he had her put into an insane asylum. So there was a rift that was created there. She never recovered from that. She headstrong, sharp, opinionated, bright woman at a time when, you know, maybe there wasn't as many places for bright women as there are today. Other questions?
If Booth wasn't captured right at the time, he was still at large,
He's
how
still-
did they know it was he that?
Oh, that's a great question. Who do you think is the most well-known actor today? Just say a name. Who do you think is the most popular? Tom Hanks. Okay. It's good, good. So imagine Tom Hanks, and that's how recognizable John Wilkes Booth was. After he shot Abraham Lincoln, he jumped onto the stage and said, "Sic semper tyrannis." So it is with tyrants. He wanted the credit for killing Lincoln. He thought that the nation would applaud him as a hero for killing a tyrant. They reviled him in the South. He thought he'd cross the borders and they'd help him. Hey, you did a good job. They thought it was a cowardly act, and they reviled him. But it took a while to kind of run on the ground.
Well, you said that William was an attempted assassination at that same night, was it?
So, you know, if you read the book Killing Lincoln, I think it'll cover that. There's another great book called American Brutus, which talks about that. What he tried to do was to gather a group of people who would topple the government. So it was going to kill Lincoln, the vice president, and the secretary of state, and a bunch of other people, so that the possession of power would be lost, and that would really kind of help with the South. Well, everybody pretty much chickened out except the guy who went to kill the Secretary of State, Seward. And he came really close to killing him. It was brutal. So it was amazing he survived. And he had been, I think, in a carriage accident, so he was already kind of laid up. And then he came in, and I mean, he slashed him good. So Seward later on to buy Alaska, known as Seward's Folly, because it was such a stupid deal to buy. Probably wasn't that bad a deal. So, any other questions?
What happened to the son, the remaining son?
Robert Todd Lincoln is a guy who, interestingly enough, becomes the president of the Pullman Rail Car Company. He goes on to have a fairly successful life. In fact, you and I might say this guy is awesome, except that he lived in the shadow of his dad. You know, you're never going to eclipse Abraham Lincoln. When he dies, his wife says, your dad was a good guy, but you deserve your own place. He is buried in Arlington Cemetery. Yes.
Did they start security then with presidents after that?
I don't know when they started security with that, but I think, you know, that's a great question. The Secret Service kind of was both stopping counterfeiting and then protecting the president. You know, I would like to say yes, but when I think of like Chet Arthur or these other guys that were killed, they seem like pretty easy to get in and kill those guys. I just think it was a different temperament at that time that just wasn't even an option. You know, now we think about assassinations all the time, but there must have been something in the temperament of people that you wouldn't do that. People at the time, it was the people's house. You could walk up to the White House back then. You could knock on the door. Yes, sir.
Yes, I wanted to know if you know any story about Dr. Mudd and what part he played in all this.
So he was, this is sort of a deal where, I think his first name was Samuel, if I remember right. And so he was kind of minding his own business, and afterwards, when John Wilkes Booth killed him, it was like a witch hunt. Nobody was paying attention. A president was killed, we're just going to play catch up, and we're just going to kill whoever we can to pay for this deed. And so I think there was a movie out that talks a little bit about conspiracy, and a lot of people were railroaded at the last minute who really should not have been, put into this conspiracy. And one of them was a doctor, Samuel Mudd, who was, minding his own business when John Wilkes Booth shows up with a broken leg. He heals the leg. He walks off, and immediately he's part of the conspiracy. He tries to, clear his name. They won't have anything to do with it because people must be punished. He is put into prison, and, his name was Mudd. I mean, that's where the phrase comes from. His name was Mudd. Comes from that. He could do no right. Benedict Arnold, Samuel Mudd, same deal. You did this. His name was Mudd. He did, while he was in prison, I think help with like the yellow fever or something like that. He, as a prisoner doctor, he helped heal many, many people while they were sick from the yellow fever, if I remember right. And then from that, he gets, was it a pardon? Is that right?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter pardoned him.
So complete. I think he was let loose, and then eventually, after his death, completely we screwed up on this guy.
There's something else. I don't know if anybody here knows it, but Roger Mudd, a CBS News correspondent,
Yeah.
it's a direct descendant of him.
Wow.
That's where it's Mudd.
There you go. Yeah.
Do you think that Lincoln became such a popular president because of the Civil War or the 13th Amendment? Because there was not a lot else about him that would be greatness.
Well, I think, there's the presidency you run for and the presidency you get. Everybody who campaigns for a presidency, well, this is what's going to happen once I get in office. And then you get in office and life happens. And now you just got to deal with what you get. President Lincoln came to office at a horrible time, extremely difficult to figure out what the right thing to do. In the course of his presidency, the people on the inner circle in his cabinet came to revere him as really the right guy. The people who mocked him early on admitted he was excellent at his job. I think what made him iconic immediately was that he was assassinated. It's pretty hard to say something bad about somebody who dies. But also in his how he ran the government during the war was very illustrative to a lot of people. To this day, presidents, and it's tough being president, will read his letters for guidance and inspiration, because that guy really walked the tough walk. I think he is an American image of rags to riches. If you ever go to the town near Springfield, I'm drawing a blank here, it's where he started out, and then he was 22. The people that he started as a 22-year-old common laborer, and in 5-7 years later, he left with a desire to become something greater, to become an attorney. He really was a self-made man. And there's not a lot of countries or cultures in the world's history that have allowed people to really break through strata like that. And if you have children and you want to inspire them, you should take them to that place. It still exists. You can go tour it. It really gives kids the freedom to realize that your life is your own to choose. You can do this if you choose to. And he really was a great, he's inspirational to me for that reason. Yes, sir.
He started the Department of Agriculture, and there are a lot of other things he would have done if he had been living.
I think the people in the South also went, uh-oh. We didn't really like him because he beat us, but he was the best hope we had to some sort of amicable peace. And when he was out, they really lost their only person who was going to help them through a time of peace. The land grant universities, that's his idea. So some of the big colleges in the country, he gave them land. He said, this is federal land, you can use it to kind of promote. I mean, he did a lot of things. Yes, sir.
Did I read that it was his plan for the railroads to go west, that he started homesteading?
Yeah,
He gave railroads sections of land to build,
yeah, that's right.
started the Homesteading Act.
Yeah,
He started opening up the country here,
yeah. In fact,
his ideas.
what's interesting about the Homesteading Act is that the last one was like in 1910 or something like that. It happened many, many times in South Dakota. And one of the questions is, was it a good idea or not? The railroads liked it because everybody who has a settled needs some kind of food, so it was a great deal for them. The question is what was it? Was the migration and the Homestead Act a great victory or a blunder?
Well, just like he said about the Homestead Act, I live on a third generation farm, and that was homesteaded in 1913. My dad lives on the fifth generation. I'd be the fifth generation on his farm. That's all because of Lincoln.
Yeah. 40 acres and a plow, and it was all different kinds. It wasn't just, sometimes it was 160 acres, sometimes it was 80, it was all different kinds of it. It was like many different kinds of it. And those of you who know about the Dust Bowl era and the other things knew that that was hard once the drought area came. But we're kind of seeing a little bit of it, again, the migration continues. Probably one of the great stories of South Dakota that is not talked about in the last 100 years is the death of the small towns. Watertown, great town, will be here for a long time. The other towns, it's tough. The state's population, flat to diminishing a little bit. I just heard a guy who was speaking about the Great West from South Dakota out west and north, the empty quarter, some people call it. He sees that as a great boom in the nation because of kind of a little bit of our mentality, kind of a tough, do-it-yourself type, well-educated, hard-working, and he sees that as kind of a boom, and we've seen that, of course. The two Dakotas seem to be leading the country right now economically. He sees the same thing when you look at Wyoming and Montana and some of the other places. So, good job, people from Watertown. Okay, thank you for your time today. God bless you.